August 7, 1944, or for 23 hours. Normandy. The dawn had not yet broken when the first engines stirred. Not tanks, not trucks, but something from the sky itself, a distant hum that grew into a roar drowning out thought. A Luftwaffe radar operator stared at his screen in disbelief. The blips were everywhere, not a formation, a swarm. A biblical plague. 1,500 American aircraft were converging on a 30-mile corridor. And 200 miles away, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring sat with a glass of wine, listening to reports flood in from the front. When his chief of staff asked what orders to send, Göring whispered something that would echo through the dying Reich like a funeral bell. This is the story of 72 hours that destroyed the myth of the Luftwaffe, and the words its architect could never speak aloud. August 7, 1944, 04:23 hours. Normandy. The dawn had not yet broken over the hedgerows of France when the first engines stirred, not the growl of Panzers or the diesel cough of supply trucks, but something else, something that seemed to come from the sky itself, a distant hum that grew and swelled until it became a roar that drowned out thought. In the pre-dawn darkness, a Luftwaffe radar operator named Franz Becker stood in his cramped station near Mortain, headphones pressed against his ears, watching the green phosphorescence of his screen with growing disbelief. The blips were everywhere, not a formation, a swarm, not an attack wave, a biblical plague. He reached for his field telephone with trembling fingers, but the words died in his throat. What language could describe what he was seeing? How do you report the end of the world? Above him, invisible in the darkness but very real, nearly 1,500 aircraft were converging on a corridor of French countryside, no more than 30 miles wide. They came in waves, P-47, Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, RAF Typhoons, each one loaded with bombs, rockets, and ammunition enough to level a city block. And they were all heading toward the same target, the last great German counteroffensive in France, an operation Adolf Hitler himself had ordered with the desperate fervor of a man watching his empire crumble. The operation was called Lüttich. History would remember it as the Battle of Mortain. But for the men of the Luftwaffe, for the pilots who had once ruled European skies with Teutonic precision, it would be remembered as something else entirely. The end. The final, catastrophic proof that the war they thought they were fighting had become something altogether different. Somewhere in that darkness, in a fortified bunker 200 miles away, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring sat with a glass of looted French wine, listening to the reports flooding in from the front. He had promised Hitler, promised the Wehrmacht, promised every soldier freezing in the Eastern Front, and every family huddling in Berlin's bomb shelters that the Luftwaffe would rise again. That German ingenuity, German discipline, German will would turn the tide. But as the reports accumulated, each one more catastrophic than the last, something changed in his eyes. The bluster faded, the bravado cracked, and when his chief of staff asked him what orders should be sent to the pilots, still scrambling to meet this American onslaught, Goring said something that would echo through the bunkers and command posts of the dying Reich like a funeral bell. The words would not be recorded in official documents. They would be whispered by officers, passed between survivors, carried in letters that would never be sent, but they would be remembered. Because in 72 hours, the myth of the Luftwaffe would be destroyed so completely that even its architect could no longer pretend. To understand what happened in those 3 days of fire and steel, you must first understand what the Luftwaffe had been. Not the broken force of 1944, limping on synthetic fuel and piloted by boys who had trained for mere weeks, but the Luftwaffe of 1940, the instrument of blitzkrieg, the terror weapon that had shattered Poland in 27 days, destroyed the French Air Force before it could even scramble, and turned Rotterdam into a burning grave to prove that resistance was futile. The Luftwaffe had not merely been an air force, it had been a philosophy made manifest. That technology, wielded by a superior will, could break nations before armies even met. Hermann Göring had built it that way, a First World War ace, a recipient of the Pour le Mérite, a man who understood that modern war was not won in trenches, but in the sky. He had taken Hitler's rearmament programs and forged them into something the world had never seen, an air force designed not to defend, but to annihilate. Stukas that screamed as they dove, turning psychological terror into a tactical weapon. Messerschmitt 109s that could outmaneuver anything the Allies put in the sky. Bombers that could flatten cities while fighter escorts kept enemy interceptors at bay. It was not just effective, it was elegant. It was proof that the Reich's ideology translated into tangible superiority, and it had worked. Through Poland, through Norway, through the Low Countries and France, the Luftwaffe had been unstoppable. When Britain refused to surrender after Dunkirk, Göring had promised Hitler he would bring them to their knees from the air alone. The Battle of Britain had been the first crack in that promise. The first time the myth had wavered, but even that could be explained away. Poor intelligence, stretched logistics, the inherent difficulty of mounting an invasion across water. The Luftwaffe remained formidable. It remained feared. But by the summer of 1944, everything had changed. The war machine that had once seemed infinite was starving. Oil fields in Romania were being bombed by American B-24s. Synthetic fuel plants were reduced to rubble by RAF night raids. Training programs that had once taken a year now took 6 weeks, sometimes less. The Luftwaffe still had planes. Factories buried underground still churned out fighters by the thousands. But their Ovenserd had no fuel to fly them, no experienced pilots to man them, and no doctrine left to guide them. They were fighting a defensive war, and the Luftwaffe had never been designed for defense. The men who climbed into those cockpits in August 1944 were not the veterans of Warsaw and Paris. They were teenagers, farmers' sons, and shopkeepers' apprentices, given a manual and a prayer, and told to stop the most powerful air armada ever assembled. They had been told stories of German technical superiority, of the invincibility of disciplined Aryan pilots, of the decadence and incompetence of their American enemies. They believed, because belief was all they had left. What they were about to face would shatter that belief so completely that many would never fly again. The plan that brought those American aircraft to Normandy was born, not in desperation, but in abundance. Abundance of steel, of oil, of trained men, of industrial capacity, so vast it seemed almost incomprehensible. The United States had entered the war with an air force that was, by most measures, mediocre. But it had something no other nation possessed: the ability to scale, to take a design and produce it not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands, to train pilots not by the handful, but by the thousands, to turn war into a problem of logistics and manufacturing, then solve it with the cold efficiency of an assembly line. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces had achieved something unprecedented. It had air superiority, not just over a battlefield or a front, over an entire theater. The 9th Air Force, assigned to support General George S. Patton's Third Army, had more operational aircraft than the entire Luftwaffe could muster on the Western Front. And those aircraft were not relics or stopgaps. They were P-47 Thunderbolts, 7-ton monsters that could absorb punishment no German fighter could survive, armed with 850 caliber machine guns and racks for bombs or rockets. They were P-51 Mustangs, sleek and deadly, with range enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back. They were flown by men who had trained for over a year, who had fuel to practice, who had spare parts to keep their planes in top condition. And they were led by men who understood that air power was not a luxury or a supplement to ground war. It was the ground war. The commander of the 9 Tactical Air Command, General Elwood Pete Quesada, had pioneered a system of close air support that turned ground troops and aircraft into a single integrated weapon. Forward air controllers embedded with infantry units radioed targets directly to circling fighter bombers. Response time was measured in minutes. Tank columns, supply depots, bridges, artillery positions, all of it could be obliterated from the sky before ground forces even made contact. Patton understood this. Where other generals saw air support as an assist, Patton saw it as his cavalry. His armored columns punched through German lines, not because they were invincible, but because every counterattack, every reinforcement, every supply convoy trying to respond was destroyed from above before it could arrive. The Third Army moved faster than any army in history, not because its tanks were faster, but because the sky above them was owned absolutely and without question. The Luftwaffe pilots who rose to meet them had been told they were fighting an enemy grown soft on wealth, an air force of factory workers and farm hands who lacked the killer instinct of true warriors. They believed this because they had to. The alternative, that they were facing an enemy who had solved war itself, who had turned it into an industrial equation, was too terrible to accept. But in 72 hours, they would learn the truth. August 7th, 1944. 06:30 hours. The sky over Mortain turned silver as the sun broke through the morning haze. The German counteroffensive had begun hours earlier. Tanks of the 2nd and 116th Panzer Divisions rolling west in a desperate attempt to cut off Patton's advance and reach the sea. If they succeeded, the entire Allied breakout from Normandy would collapse. Hitler had personally ordered this attack, had stripped other fronts to provide the tanks and men needed. It was the last gamble of a regime that had run out of cards. But as those panzers rumbled through the narrow roads of the French countryside, something went wrong. The skies, which were supposed to be covered by the Luftwaffe, remained empty. The air support that had been promised, that commanders had based their entire plan upon, never arrived. Instead, the opposite happened. At 06:45, the first wave of P-47 Thunderbolts appeared. They came in low, just above the treetops, and the sound of their engines was the only warning the German tank crews had. Rockets streaked down, high-velocity projectiles designed to punch through armor. Bombs tumbled from wings, their impact shaking the earth. And then came the guns. 8 heavy machine guns per aircraft, each one firing incendiary and armor-piercing rounds at a rate that turned metal into shrapnel and men into shadows burned into steel. The Panzers tried to scatter, tried to find cover in the hedgerows and villages, but there was nowhere to hide. The Americans were flying what they called cab rank missions, aircraft stacked in layers above the battlefield, waiting to be called down by forward controllers, like taxis at a stand. One attack wave would finish its run, climb back to altitude, and another would take its place. There was no pause, no respite, just a continuous rolling thunder that transformed the roads into graveyards. Oberleutnant Hans Weiss, piloting one of the few Me-109s that managed to take off that morning, climbed toward the American formations with a heart full of fury and fear. He was 23, a veteran of the Eastern Front, and he had shot down 11 Soviet aircraft. He knew how to fight. But as he broke through the cloud layer and saw what awaited him, his training faltered. There were dozens of them, dozens. And circling above like hawks waiting for prey, he could see the glint of more P-51 escorts, faster than anything he flew, flown by men who had been training for this moment longer than he had been in the Luftwaffe. He dove anyway, because what else could he do? His cannons chattered, tracers arcing toward a P-47, but the American plane simply absorbed the hits and kept flying. Then, something flashed past him, another Mustang, turning inside his arc with impossible speed, and his engine exploded. He ejected, felt the shock of the parachute deploying, and floated down into a forest where American infantry would find him an hour later, burned and weeping. He was one of the lucky ones. By noon on August 7th, the German counteroffensive had stalled, not because of American tanks or infantry, but because every road leading to the front was choked with burning vehicles, supply trucks that would never deliver their ammunition, fuel tankers that erupted into fireballs, visible for miles, ambulances marked with red crosses, targeted anyway, because the Americans had learned that the Wehrmacht often hid ammunition in them. The rules of chivalric warfare, the codes that had governed combat for centuries, had no place in this new reality. This was industrial annihilation. This was what happened when one side had so many resources that mercy became a luxury it no longer needed to afford. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. Orders went out from Göring's headquarters. Every available aircraft was to be scrambled, regardless of fuel reserves, regardless of pilot readiness. They had to stop this, had to prove that German air power still mattered. Over the next 24 hours, nearly 200 German fighters took to the sky, the largest Luftwaffe sortie on the Western Front in months. They were slaughtered. The Americans had radar. They had forward observers with radios calling in positions. They had numerical superiority so vast that they could afford to send entire squadrons just to hunt German fighters, while other squadrons continued ground attack missions. German pilots, who had trained for 6 weeks, found themselves in dogfights with Americans who had trained for over a year and had fuel enough to practice every maneuver until it was instinct. The kill ratio was catastrophic. For every American plane shot down, 4 German aircraft fell, and the Americans could replace their losses. The Germans could not. A Luftwaffe pilot named Erich Hartmann, unrelated to the famous ace of the same name, wrote in a letter that would be found on his body 3 days later, "We are not fighting pilots anymore. We are fighting a system, a machine that does not tire, does not doubt, does not run out of bullets. When I see them in the sky, I do not see men. I see the end of everything we were promised." August 8th, 1944. The second day was worse. The German counteroffensive, deprived of supplies and reinforcements, began to collapse. Tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned. Infantry units, pinned down by constant air attack, surrendered in groups, and the Luftwaffe, which had promised to shield them, was simply gone. Not withdrawn, gone. The few aircraft that still flew did so in ones and twos, dodging through clouds, praying they would not be seen. When they were seen, they were destroyed. Patton's Third Army began to advance again, moving so fast that supply lines struggled to keep up. But the supplies were not the bottleneck. The roads were clear, the skies were safe, and the enemy was broken. The armored columns rolled through villages that still flew swastika flags, past German soldiers who stared in disbelief as American tanks passed them without stopping, because there were bigger targets ahead, and these men were already defeated. And above it all, the aircraft continued their relentless hunt. Fighter bombers prowled the roads like wolves, attacking anything that moved. Heavy bombers, freed from the need to strike distant factories, turned their payloads on tactical targets, bridges, rail yards, troop concentrations. The 8th Air Force, the Strategic Bombing Command, joined the 9th in what became the most concentrated application of air power in military history. In a 72-hour span, over 6,000 sorties were flown, 6,000 individual missions, each one contributing to the total, systematic destruction of German capability in that narrow stretch of France. The Luftwaffe had no answer. It had no fuel for sustained operations. It had no experienced pilots to lead the novices. It had no doctrine for this kind of warfare, because no one had imagined that the sky itself could become a weapon of such totality. The men who had once flown over Warsaw and Paris, who had believed in their own superiority, were now hiding in barns and forests, watching their air force disintegrate. And in his bunker, Hermann Göring received the reports with a silence that terrified his staff more than any rage could have. There is a story, unverified, passed through the ranks like folklore, that on the evening of August 8th, Göring summoned his chief of staff and asked for an honest assessment, not propaganda, not optimism, truth. The chief of staff, a man named Kohler who had served since the beginning, hesitated. Then he said, "Herr Reichsmarschall, we have lost air superiority, not tactically, not temporarily, completely. If this continues, the Luftwaffe will cease to exist as a fighting force within a month." Göring, according to the story, poured himself another glass of wine. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "I promised the Führer that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. I told him we would break England from the sky. I swore that German pilots were worth 10 of theirs." He drank. "I was wrong about everything." The chief of staff said nothing. What could he say? Outside, the distant rumble of artillery echoed through the earth. The front was collapsing. The Reich was dying. And the Luftwaffe, the instrument that was supposed to prove German superiority, had become a symbol of its opposite. The next morning, Göring issued orders to withdraw all remaining fighters from France. There would be no more mass sorties, no more attempts to contest American air dominance. The Luftwaffe would conserve what little it had left for the defense of Germany itself. It was, in essence, an admission of defeat. The skies over France belonged to the Allies, completely, irrevocably. August 9th, 1944. The final day of the 72-hour period dawned clear and bright, the kind of summer morning that in another time might have been called beautiful. But for the men trapped in the Mortain pocket, it was the opposite of beauty. It was the sky that betrayed them, the sky that offered no clouds to hide in, no storms to ground the enemy, nothing but perfect visibility for the aircraft that circled above like angels of death. The German forces, what remained of them, attempted one last push. Not to win. They knew winning was impossible now, but to break out, to escape the encirclement before Patton's tanks closed the noose entirely. They moved at night, hoping darkness would shield them. But when dawn came, the aircraft returned. And this time, they brought something new, napalm. The P-47s came in low, releasing canisters that tumbled end over end before erupting into walls of liquid fire. The flames clung to everything, metal, earth, flesh. Tank crews that had survived rockets and bombs burned alive in their vehicles, unable to escape fast enough. Infantry that had endured artillery barrages were consumed by fire that water could not extinguish. The smell, survivors would later say, was what broke them. Not the sight of death, but the smell of it, sweet and chemical and wrong. By midday, the breakout had failed. By evening, organized German resistance in the Mortain pocket had ceased. Over 20,000 Wehrmacht soldiers surrendered in the following days, stumbling out of forests and cellars with their hands raised, eyes hollow. They had gone into battle believing in German superiority, in the discipline and technology and will that was supposed to overcome all obstacles. They emerged knowing that those things meant nothing against an enemy who could darken the sky with aircraft and turn roads into rivers of fire. The Luftwaffe had flown exactly 11 sorties on August 9th, for Blanc, Pure, La Fournape, 2,000 American and British missions. The ratio was so lopsided that it ceased to be warfare and became something closer to extermination. In the months that followed, the story of those 72 hours spread through the German military like a contagion. Soldiers who had never seen the battle spoke of it in hushed tones. Pilots who had fought on other fronts asked to be transferred anywhere, except to face American air power. The Mortain pocket became a legend, not of heroism, but of futility, of what happened when ideology met industrial reality and lost. Hermann Göring would never recover his reputation. Hitler blamed him publicly, stripping him of authority, reducing him to a figurehead bloated on morphine and denial. The Luftwaffe continued to exist on paper, continued to fly missions, but it was a ghost of itself. By the end of 1944, it had been reduced to launching desperate jet fighter attacks and suicide ramming missions, tactics born not of strength, but of despair. But the men who survived those 3 days in Normandy carried something else with them, a knowledge that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had seen the future, not a future of Aryan supremacy or technological wonder, but a future where war was won, not by the bravest or the most skilled, but by the side that could produce more, supply more, destroy more. They had seen abundance weaponized. They had seen democracy's industrial heart beating so strongly that it could afford to crush them with overwhelming, relentless mechanical efficiency. One German infantryman captured on August 10th was interviewed by an American intelligence officer. When asked what had broken his unit's morale, he did not mention tanks or artillery. He said, "We stopped believing when we realized you would never run out, that you could lose 100 planes and send 200 more, that you had so much that you did not even have to be careful. We were rationing bullets, and you were dropping entire bombs on individual trucks. How do you fight an enemy like that? How do you fight abundance?" The officer had no answer, because the answer was, you don't. There is a photograph from those days, taken by an American reconnaissance plane on August 8th. It shows a stretch of road near Mortain, perhaps 2 miles long. On it are the wrecks of 73 vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, cars. Some are burning, some are already blackened hulks. Some have bodies, still visible inside them. The road curves through a pastoral landscape of hedgerows and farms, and in the late afternoon light, it might almost look peaceful, if not for the destruction carved through its center. That road became a symbol, not in propaganda. It was too horrific for that, but in the minds of the men who fought there. For the Germans, it was proof that everything they had been told was a lie. For the Americans, it was proof that their way of war, industrial, systematic, abundant, worked. That democracy, for all its inefficiencies and debates and compromises, could organize itself into a force that totalitarianism could not match. The Luftwaffe had been built on the idea that will and ideology could overcome material disadvantage, that a smaller, more disciplined, more racially pure force could defeat larger but supposedly decadent enemies. Mortain proved the opposite. It proved that abundance, when organized and unleashed, was its own form of power. That a nation that could afford to send 1,500 aircraft to destroy a single counteroffensive would win, not because its pilots were braver or its technology superior, but because it could afford to win. Because it had so much that loss became irrelevant. Years later, after the war, a historian would interview surviving Luftwaffe pilots for an oral history project. One of them, a man named Otto Schultz, who had flown Mi-109s over Mortain, described the moment he understood the war was lost. It was not when he saw the number of American planes, or when his squadron was decimated, or even when he was shot down. It was when he was captured and taken to an American field camp. They gave us food, he said. Real food, not the sawdust bread we had been eating, not the watery soup, meat, fresh bread, chocolate, and the American soldiers, they were eating the same thing. I realized then that this was normal for them, that what seemed like luxury to us was everyday life for them, that they could fly 1,000 missions and still have enough to feed their prisoners better than we fed our own troops. That was when I understood. We were not fighting an army. We were fighting a country that did not know how to be poor. That realization, that abundance itself was a weapon, would define the post-war world. The Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe, the Cold War's ideological struggle between command economies and market democracies, all of it traced back to that fundamental lesson, that a system which could produce more would in the end win, not because it was morally superior or more just, but because it was more effective. The Luftwaffe had been a beautiful machine, a testament to engineering and courage and discipline, but it had been designed for a world that no longer existed, a world where wars were won by small, elite forces, achieving decisive victories through skill and daring. The Americans had built something else, a machine not of elegance, but of mass. And when the two met over Normandy in August 1944, the outcome was never in doubt. August 11th, 1944. Hermann Göring stood on the balcony of his estate at Karen Hall, staring out over the forests of Prussia. Inside, aides were packing artwork stolen from across Europe, preparing for the inevitable retreat eastward. The reports from France were unambiguous. The Mortain counteroffensive had failed catastrophically. Patton's Third Army was racing toward the Seine. The Luftwaffe had been effectively erased from the Western Front. He had one glass of wine left in the bottle beside him, French wine from a vineyard he could not remember the name of. He poured it slowly, watching the dark liquid catch the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the rumble of thunder. Or perhaps it was artillery. It was getting harder to tell the difference. An aide approached, nervous. "Herr Reichsmarschall, the Führer is calling for an update." Göring did not turn. He raised the glass to his lips, drank, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Tell him we fought. Tell him we flew every plane we had. Tell him the pilots were brave. And the truth, sir?" Göring set down the empty glass. He watched it catch the light, refracting it into colors that danced across the stone railing. Then he turned and walked inside, his footsteps heavy, his shoulders bent under the weight of promises broken and illusions shattered. He never answered the question, because the truth was too terrible, too complete. The truth was that 72 hours had proven what every subsequent year of war would confirm, that the Luftwaffe and the ideology it represented had been defeated not by better men or better machines, but by a force that did not need to be better. It only needed to be more. And in the end, more was enough. The sky over Normandy is quiet now. The roads where Panzers burned have been repaved. The fields where men fell are green with crops, peaceful under a sun that no longer brings terror. But if you listen, if you stand,